Greetings, salutations, and words of goodwill. This is another video in what's going to be a series on early Christian heresies. Today we're going to talk about Manichaeism. Just as a heads up, this particular video comes from an earlier video that I made that was much longer, in which I covered 4 particular heresies. And so the main content of the video is going to probably have a slightly different audio resolution than what we're starting with. But short of re-recording the audio for the whole thing, which seems a little bit unnecessary, that's just the situation I find myself in. Anyway, it's going to begin here, and hope you enjoy. And the heresy we're covering in 3C is Manichaeism, right? I might slip up. I have a tendency of calling it Manichaeanism, and that's because the people who follow Manichaeism are usually called Manichaeans. So forgive me, but the normal phrase for it is Manichaeism. Manichaeism is a syncretistic missionary Zoroastrian offshoot that incorporated the mythology of local religions for the sake of converting adherents to the underlying ideology. Now, what does that mean? Well, the syncretistic thing basically just means they're doing the same thing the Gnostics did. And so your book actually refers to them as Gnostics, although I don't think that that's accurate, because the Gnostics in this time frame are essentially Neoplatonists, right? And the Manichees are Zoroastrians, right? So that's the essential distinction between them, right? That it's syncretistic, yes, but it's not Neoplatonic, it's Zoroastrian. Now, is there any Neoplatonism in it? Probably, but ultimately it's a Zoroastrian religion, or a form of Zoroastrianism, which we'll get to in a second, right? But what makes it syncretistic, in case it's not clear, is that it is the incorporating the mythology of local religions, right? Syncretism is a way of taking a bunch of different schools of thought or of religion and molding them together, weaving them together into something. And so the way that Manichaeism is syncretistic primarily is that it takes local mythologies and it weaves them into its own system. And of course, the reason that it does this is because it doesn't really care about the particulars of the faith, you might say, the individual aspects like, Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension or something like that. Instead, what it cares about is the moral ideas underneath it. And so any story it can use to teach those moral ideas is the story that it's going to use. And they justify this, right? And it's not so much a criticism of them, it's just the truth, that they justify this by basically being of the assumption that their good God has reached into all of these various religions in an attempt to teach the reality of the world, which, as far as they're concerned, is their underlying moral ideology, right? And so all of these myths probably do teach the reality to some degree or another, depending on how well preserved they've been, if Manichaeans are right. And so given that fact, why not use the myths, right? And so that's the idea, though. So the syncretism is the fact that they use these myths for the underlying ideology, the moral precepts that they're going to teach, which we'll get to in a second. So all that there's really left to talk about is the fact that it's missionary, which means that it wants to spread itself. Its goal is to get more adherents. And its goal is to get more people following Manichaeism, right? And then the fact that it's Zoroastrian. Now, what is Zoroastrianism? Zoroastrianism is a religion that follows a prophet whose name in English is usually referred to as Zoroaster. However, in his native language, it's something more like Zarathustra. So occasionally you'll see it written Zarathustra. If you ever read Nietzsche, he writes this book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he's just appropriating the name for himself. But so these people follow this guy named Zoroaster, and he lived before Moses in ancient Persia. And basically, at the time in ancient Persia, there were these 2 groups of people, right? You had these sedentary farmers who actually made things and grew food and took care of themselves, right? And then you had these, sort of jerks on horses, these knights, right? And what they would do is they'd run around and they'd steal stuff from the farmers. So the farmers were taking care of themselves and the knights and being slaughtered. And Zoroaster stands up and basically says, this is not right, you must stop. So basically, right, he creates this mythology or this religion in which all of the gods of the horse-riding people are evil and all of the gods of the farming people are good. And so everyone should follow the farming gods, which are all sort of molded into this one god, who he calls Ahura Mazda, which is the highest of the gods. And then, of course, the gods of the nomadic horsemen who are stealing all this stuff, they all get combined into this single evil force, which is Angra Mainyu, which makes Zoroastrianism unique insofar as it's not a monotheistic religion like we're used to, where there's one god, and then Satan is like this angel who's a pitiful nothing compared to him, right? And so the forces of good are powerful, and the forces of evil are relatively weak compared to the forces of good, right? In Zoroastrianism, there are two gods. They're always at war, one of which is the good god, and one of which is the evil god. And you obviously want to be on the side of the good god because then you're good, right? So that's Zoroastrianism in a nutshell. And again, as you can see on the screen, that idea is called dualism, right? Which is different than monotheism. So then let's talk about some basic aspects of Manichaeism then. It was founded in Persia by a man, and I might not be able to say this right, whose name is Shuraik, but he takes the title Mani, so everyone calls him Mani. Okay, and Mani is kind of like a title like Buddha or Christ. Literally, I think it means basically the same thing as Buddha, which is illuminated one, right? The man who's filled with light, right? And so that's Mani. So his followers are Manichaeans or Manichees, depending on which book you're reading. So that's the guy who founded it, right? And that's where it gets its name from, right? They are the followers of the illuminated one, who's Mani. And basically, Mani taught this dualism, right? That there's this perfectly good God who is the god of light, and there's this perfectly evil god who's the god of darkness. Okay, and so that's the dualist aspect of the religion. And it's one of the more important underlying ideologies. And what the Manichaeans did is that they would break all of their followers up into the elect and the hearers, right? So there were two groups of people. And you could essentially think of the elect as the clergy and hearers as the regular followers of the religion. It'd be more accurate to refer to the elect as strict followers of the religion, though, and the hearers as like weaker followers or lesser followers. The elect were all wandering monks. So they moved from place to place, and they were celibates, essentially, right? They're all wandering monks. Whereas the adherers lived more or less normal lives within the context of this religion, obviously. And so they were required to keep their 10 commandments, which aren't exactly the same as our 10 commandments, but they had 10 and they had to keep them. And then on top of that, they had to worship and support the elect, which might sound like it's some sort of personality cult sort of thing where the elect are trying to manipulate these people to take care of them, which might be fair. But I want to say that the elect actually are true believers in this religion for the most part, because we're going to see here in a second what the requirements were for being a member of the elect. And they aren't easy, right? It's not something you would, if you were trying to create a religion, like a health and wealth gospel sort of thing, where you're like, oh, give me your money and I'll make you happier, right? This would not be the way to do it, okay? It's a little bit too stringent for that. So I think it'd be more accurate to say that the reason that you have the elect and the hearers is because if every person on earth followed Manichaeism the way that the elect did, everyone would be dead in a couple of weeks, right? And so the system just cannot function if everybody really, really, really follows it. And so what develops is people who really, really, really follow it, who will die if the lesser followers don't make sure that they don't die, right? And so that's where this support thing comes from, and then you worship them because like they're really doing it, right? And I'm, if you're a hearer, I'm just a weak guy who can't really do all of this, but I respect them for actually achieving the religion. Now, just like Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism has this threefold morality, right? What Zoroaster taught was that you should say no evil, do no evil, and think no evil. So if you do those three things, then you'll be a decent person, more or less, right? And that's the essential underlying theology from the moral standpoint of Manichaeism, right? Speak no evil, do no evil, and think no evil, except that they add something to the speaking principle, which is eat no evil. Because they have foods that are supposed to be good for your soul and foods that are supposed to be bad for your soul. And so they've thrown that into the speaking no evil thing because you do both with your mouth, right? So you might be able to think about Manichaeism as sort of like a do no evil with your mouth, do no evil with your mind, and do no evil with your hands, right? In the speaking, doing, and thinking of Zoroastrianism, right? And so then speaking and eating can kind of get mixed together, and they take that out of the Zoroastrian moral principles, which is speaking, doing, and thinking. On top of that, they all prayed 4 times a day, facing either the sun, the moon, or north, depending on what time of day it is and whether or not you were in a situation where you could see the sun or the moon. And the reason that they would do that is because Zoroastrians worship fire, and because they take the God of good as a God of light thing very literally. And so they worship fire, and those are giant lights in the sky, and right, so they're like heavenly lights, right? And so if you're going to worship the light, then you should worship the heavenly lights. So that's what they do. Finally, and this is what really gets St. Augustine interested in them, because St. Augustine was a Manichae for a very long time, is that, and I think this is actually what attracts most people to their religion, is that they're trying to create a perfectly consistent intellectual system so that you don't need to have faith to believe it, right? That the system is so non-contradictory that it just explains everything perfectly. And you just hold it all in your mind, and if you just do that, then there's no reason to have faith in any of it, right? You just know it without a doubt. And so that makes it clearly distinct from Christianity, and that's the important distinction that Augustine finds in his life, is that idea of being able to think yourself into salvation. If you just know the right thing, then you'll always do it, right? It becomes something that he finds ultimately to be not true of himself. So, but that's why most people find it compelling. The last thing we want to do with Manichaeism is to look at the requirements of the elect, what the elect had to do, to show you that it was pretty strict. So that should be up on the screen now, and what it says is that they were forbidden from owning property, so complete poverty. They couldn't eat meat or drink wine. They couldn't settle in one spot, so they could not have a home. They had to be homeless. Doesn't mean they had to sleep outdoors, but they had to be homeless. They couldn't get a job, which strictly speaking means they could make money in no way, shape, or form. If they couldn't, mind you, they didn't own anything, but if they did own something or they had it in their possession, they couldn't sell it. They were not allowed to be economically productive in any way, shape, or form. They weren't allowed to practice magic, which, fine, I guess that forbids trying to tell the future and practicing other religions. And finally, they were not allowed to satisfy their sexual desires in any way, shape, or form at all, right? And that, A through F there, that's a really difficult thing to do, right? And so if you were just trying to manipulate people into taking care of you, you could see why that's not, you take it a little easier on yourself. And you could also see there why I would say that if everyone were elect, right, we would all die, because none of us would be economically productive, which means that we wouldn't have food, right? And so you want to have food, otherwise you die. We also wouldn't have shelters, in most likely, because if no one's staying in one spot, then probably no one's building buildings, right? And so a system of only the elect just wouldn't work, which is why they developed this system of the hearers. The only thing that might be strange on this list that you wouldn't just understand, oh yeah, I could see sort of why they do that, is the no eating meat part. The no drinking wine, okay, yeah, because it gets you drunk and blah 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 blah, right? You make poor decisions while you're drunk, and okay. But the no eating meat, why not eating meat? And the reason for this is that the Manichaees share this idea with the Gnostics that matter is basically evil. So meat is very obviously nutrient dense. Right? That's why we like it so much, because it's full of nutrients, which means that it's full of matter. And if matter is evil, then eating it is not good, you see. And on top of that, plants get their energy from the sun, right? And ancient individuals, classical, really, it's sort of after the ancient time frame, they weren't stupid. They knew this, right? It doesn't take that long for you to figure that out. If you have a flower in a pot and you stick it in a room without a window, it's dead after a couple of days, right? So, like, clearly plants need the sun. And so, given that fact, they figured, now this is where they might go wrong scientifically or whatever, but they figured that the plants must be full of light, because without the light they die, so they must be full of light. And since they take this idea that the good God is a God of light very literally, right? They want to get that light into their body. And this is where the eating no evil aspect of their religion comes into play. So that's Manichaeism. So there you go. Hope you found that adequately edifying and that you enjoyed watching it. In the next video, we'll be covering Montanism down in Papusa and Phrygia. And stick around for it. And as always, there's the obligatory like, subscribe, comment, etc., etc. And hope to see you around.